What attracted me to ethnomusicology? I think I was trained in classical piano playing, as thousands of people are, and while I went to a music school because of that particular training and skill, I was concerned that most of the music that I knew about other than classical music were completely ignored in the music school. I think for my generation this is not a strange story. And so I thought really maybe ethnomusicology would be the way to kind of work at rectifying my own deficit of knowledge and then becoming a teacher that could be a little bit more responsible. I got cold feet at one point. I thought the world is a very big place and they seem to want people to teach about everything. You know, if you're an ethnomusicologist, and how could that possibly be done? But then I decided that my desire to learn more was going to override that nervousness and that I'd figure it out later. So I guess I did. I stayed at the University of Toronto where I'd done my undergraduate degrees quite simply for financial reasons. I couldn't afford American university fees. And they had it was a very strange circumstance in a way. They had hired Mieczysław Kolinski, very famous Polish ethnomusicologist, who had been, he was Jewish and he was on the Nazi list during the Second World War, had hid out in the attic of a Belgian family during most of the war years and then eventually made his way to North America. But he had this very traumatic experience and he had nothing to do in that attic except get into his own head about how you can analyze music. So some of the things that he eventually worked out were kind of divorced from social realities because of the circumstance in which he'd kind of worked on that. I was influenced, of course, by other scholars, Alan Marion, John Blacking, the big scholars of that generation. And yeah, so I tried to learn from as many of the scholars in the field as I could. I realized that very little work had been done on any indigenous music in Canada. And I think when I was 23, I had a colonialist attitude towards such music. So I felt somehow, like many of my predecessors, that someone should go and record this music, you know, not being too sure how healthy the music cultures were. Turns out they're very healthy indeed, which is good news. So I did what we now look down upon as extractive research in the very earliest phases. I went to the Arctic and worked mostly in 3 Inuit communities there and learned a lot about the drum dance repertoire. There was a little bit of popular music starting to happen, some throat singing, which has become one of the best known Inuit genres now. Yeah, so that's how it started. I then did some work with other First Nations, the Innu First Nation. Sounds like Inuit, but it's entirely different. It's an Anishinaabe-related culture in Labrador. And then, again, I was worried about what ethnomusicologists weren't doing in Indigenous studies, and this is now decades ago. This has changed a lot in recent decades, but at that point, nobody was looking at contemporary artists. Nobody was looking at popular musicians. The range of genres that were being used and recombined in creative and decolonizing ways. So I started working much more with contemporary musicians. I was also doing quite a lot of work on gender issues at that time. Published a book called Music and Gender together with my Finnish colleague Pirkka Moistila. And so I had certain issues that interested me, but it was more this contemporary Indigenous scene that began more and more to attract me. And that I felt was also a better way of working. It was a little bit less informed by colonial paradigms and more kind of trying to be understanding but also supportive of contemporary Indigenous musicians. So that work continues really to the present day. That meant that I wasn't actually doing as much community-based work, although I still stayed in touch with certain communities. I lived in Haudenosaunee territory at that time. I now live in the territory of the Beothuk, the Mi'kmaq, the Innu Nation, and in a province where Inuit and Innu people live in Labrador, not quite where I live, but the same province. So in each case, I've come to get to have friendships and get to know people from those different nations, as well as the popular musicians that I sought out myself for various things. I got interested in a lot of different issues. One was recording studios and how Indigenous people were kind of working in them, because recording studios, as you know, think they're going to have sort of normal pop music practices, and what do if they get an ensemble and several frame drums, and even how do they record powwow? It's a tricky thing to record powwow music. Chris Scales has, of course, written a wonderful book on that now, but in those days, those were all interesting questions. And a lot of the women that I was working with were finding the recording studio somewhat alienating. The studio engineers were usually male, and often they didn't ask too much about what the women wanted to achieve or help them understand technologically what was possible. So I did a project on women in the recording studios, and I've tried to learn more and more about studio practice. I've worked as a musician in recording studios a few times, but I tried to learn a little bit more from the production side of it. I went to Newfoundland as what we call in Canada a Canada Research Chair in 2002, and my goal there was, St. John's, Newfoundland is not a very big city, about 250,000 people in the vicinity of St. John's anyway. And so I thought this is a very good place to try to change the paradigm of how universities and communities interact. So set up a research center there called the Research Center for Music, Media, and Place that wanted to work collaboratively with communities. So initially, of course, we came up with ideas, and we'd approach the community and say, would you have any interest in working with us? But eventually, after a few years, it turned around, and communities started coming to us. And I thought this was a very nice shift in the usual relationships between universities and communities. We produced a CD series with booklets, some of them over 100 pages, so they were more like little books, but more extensive documentation that you'd usually have. And when I retired a few years ago, Harris Berger was hired to direct the center, and I've just been delighted that he has maintained the community work. So we continue, that center continues. Part of my interest in recording technology led me to think I wanted to write a book on audio recordings in Newfoundland and Labrador. Everybody knows about music in Newfoundland and Labrador. They mostly know about traditional unaccompanied singers. They know about the fiddle traditions, which are quite vibrant, but they think of it as a live tradition, and they're not aware that there were 4,000 plus audio recordings made since about the 70s in that province. So I've just finished a book called On Record, Audio Recording, Mediation and Citizenship in Newfoundland and Labrador. So that's been kind of fun and a new area for me in a way. I mean, just working with incredible Indigenous musicians. I didn't mention also that there was so much international exchange going on that round about the 90s at some point, I thought I'd like to understand more about another Indigenous community, and I loved some of the recordings coming out of the Sami communities of Scandinavia, Norway, Finland, and Sweden. So I started some work there as well, initially on festivals, but then I got to know quite a few individuals, did some community-based work, and again, continued working with contemporary musicians in one capacity or another. So that made me think a little bit more about indigeneity on a more global scale, I guess, even though, of course, nobody knows everything about global scales, but at least I knew something other than the areas of First Nations practice that I had been familiar with earlier. It's mostly the people that are the highlights, You meet these incredible people in the work that we do, and they're doing amazing work with such creative energy that's it's fantastic. And I still love the older generation's songs, and I still love what is there in the archives that I think needs to be, we need to do, in North America, we need more repatriation work. There's been some done by institutions like the Library of Congress and by some individuals, but there's much, and certainly here at Indiana University, there's been a lot of repatriation initiatives. So, yep, it's important. Well, I was in a panel today where someone was making the point that music animates conversation about important things, and that all of the activist work that we may think is important, whether it's ecological, whether it's on human rights, whether it's anti-racist work, all of those sorts of things need that animation. It's not the frill. It is at the center of work of that sort, and it's what brings people together. And so I do think it's important. I think the sound studies people, especially those working on ecological issues, are going to play a huge role in terms of environmental initiatives, attempts to return the planet to some sort of livable state, which we're all very worried about right now. We should have been worried about it decades and decades ago, of course. So I think an attuneness to sound, which is so often dismissed as peripheral, is something that we contribute in many ways, whether it's music or whether it's sound of other sorts, other species, those things. I think those are really important.